Hello and welcome to Birth Time, the podcast. Following the success of our world-renowned and international award-winning film, Birth Time, the documentary, we are coming back together to explore a wide variety of topics around pregnancy, birth and postpartum. As a way of exploring topics in great depth, we will be covering one topic over several episodes, bringing you up-to-date evidence-based information from academics, practitioners and birth workers, as well as stories and lived experiences from birthing women and people and their families. We will also have interludes with people we interviewed in Birth Time the documentary, finding out where life has taken them since the creation of the film. Join your hosts, homebirth midwife Jo Hunter and doula and birth photographer Jerusha Sutton as we delve deep into the world of growing and birthing babies. Hello, you lovely folks out there. I am Jerusha Sutton and I've got my co-host Jo Hunter here. We are so thrilled you're joining us on this journey. This is our second episode of Birth Time, the podcast. If you haven't listened to our first episode with Mel Briggs, please go back and do that. It's a beautiful update on what is happening with Birthing on Country at Waminda and the development of their birth centre, which if you've seen our documentary, you would have heard all about back then. This is a very important update. So Jo and I will be your co-hosts for this podcast. And occasionally Zoe's going to jump on and join us as well. We're going to do episodes with some of the people from Birth Time. We're going to catch up on where her life has taken them since we made the film. So Zoe will join us for those episodes.
Occasionally she'll probably step in as well for interviews during the series if we've got an interview set up and one of us can't make it because we're at a birth. Zoe will jump in on that with the other person that's doing it.
How we're going to roll around here is we are going to cover a series of topics in this podcast. We will do multiple episodes on one topic so we can really hone in into the depths of the topics that we are discovering and exploring.
We're going to look at specific topics from a variety of perspectives, and we're hoping to get academics, women, partners, midwives, birth workers, doulas, educators, politicians from all walks of life, basically discussing one topic. So our first topic that we're going to discuss is birth trauma, and we've got a variety of guests that we're really excited about interviewing and having a chat with over the coming weeks. And our very first interviewer, we decided that we wanted to start with some heart rather than some head. So we're interviewing Athena Hammond, who is a midwife and psychotherapist and simply gorgeous human.
The timing of this topic is particularly poignant, given that the New South Wales Birth Trauma Inquiry has just handed in its report, its recommendations and findings. So exploring birth trauma at this point feels like particularly relevant timing on that. There may be some content in this series that people find confronting, so please do take care of yourself and reach out for help and support if you do feel like you need it. These are big subjects to explore. So first up in our birth trauma series today, we have the magnificent Athena Hammond joining us. Athena is a midwife and a psychotherapist who lives in the beautiful Northern Rivers village of South Golden Beach, just down the road from me. She has a background and research in teaching and has worked in many different ways to support women and families over the past 20 years. Nowadays, she is focused on working as a therapist with a range of folks, including women, midwives, and obstetricians. She has a special interest in birth trauma, is the mum of a grown-up son, and makes a mean bowl of guacamole. Should we start with that? We can come back to that. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jerusha Sutton. Lovely to be here.
What nobody has actually said is that you two are two of my very most favourite people on the whole planet, and both of you live very far away now, and I'm very sad about it. We're stoked to have you on, love. What you haven't said in your bio when we asked you to send a bio is that you're also a doctor of midwifery. So you hold a PhD You worked alongside me for 2 years as a second midwife at homebirths, which was just magnificent, and I miss you greatly. So this series that we're doing, you're first up in our series, and I think you hold a pretty unique space in this topic, given that you are a midwife as well as a psychotherapist. And also you've had your own lived experience as a woman and a midwife who has experienced birth trauma. So it's a huge topic. It's one that's very much at the forefront at the moment of, it's kind of like a buzzword, and it's something that we're all talking about, which is good. It's a good thing. Recently, the New South Wales Parliament have had an inquiry into birth trauma, and there's been 43 recommendations put forward by the Select Committee. You were involved early on in this process, weren't you? Before any of the hearings, and you were asked to go to Parliament House in Sydney and talk with the Select Committee. Can you just, before we actually get into the topic of birth trauma, maybe you can just explain to us what your role was in that meeting and how you were involved from the perspective of the inquiry?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to say that I'm also sitting here with two of my favourite people in the world. And that all of that love is graciously and gushingly returned. And thank you very much for the beautiful introduction. In terms of the birth trauma inquiry, I was contacted before the inquiry actually commenced. They do a thing that they call an expert briefing. So they pull in a few people who are considered to have expert knowledge around the topic or the space. And there were 3 of us that went in. Myself and the fantastic Hazel Keedle were 2 of them. And we actually brief, so sort of prepare the members of the committee to think about raising their awareness and creating a space that's going to allow them to work with the participants in particular, and to kind of frame up and contextualize what it is that they're going to hear and what might it mean. And I guess from my perspective, I was very focused on wanting to convey to them some really kind of practical trauma-informed processes or guidelines, because my concern was really for the women who were going to be coming in to tell their stories in person at the hearings. And we wanted it to be very, very clear. The way that the Select Committee works is that the people who are the members of the committee don't necessarily have any background in the topic that the inquiry is focused on. So they're just kind of tapped on the shoulder as part of their job to come and sit on the committee. So you can imagine that if you don't have any experience or knowledge in this space, it might be quite difficult to conceptualize or understand how to be with women who are telling their traumatic stories in that space. So that was sort of my focus, was on trying to set that up so that was going to be as supportive as possible for the women who were coming in.
Do you know if they had anybody specifically there for the women? Like, obviously they could have been, probably were re-traumatized by sharing their story. Like, did they have some sort of person there that was there to be with them through that process?
My understanding was, so there was a few things that happened. One of the changes that they made was that people didn't give their testimony individually. So this is one of the things that came out of the briefing, was that women came and had others with them. Yeah, sort of as they were giving their testimony. And my understanding was that, yes, there was a counsellor who was available.
Okay.
Women during the hearings. I actually never followed up on that, but my understanding was that was going to be provided.
Interesting. Okay, so let's just start with the basics.
Okay.
The very basics, like nuts and bolts basics.
Okay.
What is birth trauma?
What is birth trauma is a very good question. So there's a few things that I think about when I consider what is birth trauma. At the moment, there's a definition that I'm really liking that I'm actually just going to read to you, which came out of a paper that was like a kind of concept analysis that talked to a lot of consumers and a lot of women who had distressing experiences. And I feel like this is a nice kind of inclusive way of thinking about what is birth trauma. So it says, a woman's, I would perhaps say a person's experience of interactions and or events related to childbirth that cause overwhelming, distressing emotions and reactions, leading to short or long-term negative impacts on health and well-being. That's a really nice way to think about it. There are like diagnostic criteria that sit around birth trauma. There is actually a tool now that was developed by the University of London, which is a kind of sort of like the Edinburgh Depression Scale, you know, it's like a scaling tool that you can register which symptoms or experiences you're having. But this definition that I've just read to you is much more open than that. It's about what does the woman feel are overwhelming, distressing emotions and reactions. So rather than sort of tick boxing the criteria, it sort of opens things up a little bit. And I think that's particularly important because, like all trauma, birth trauma exists on a continuum. Yeah, so sort of at one end of the continuum, we have women who go through the experience and come out the other side with a bunch of feelings that they didn't have going in to the experience. So those feelings are often things like a sort of inexplicable sense of being grief-stricken, feeling angry, anxious, ashamed, confused. A lot of the time women experience a really significant loss of trust. So trust in themselves, trust in the world, often trust in their partner, which is a very tricky little piece. Feelings of overwhelm, failure, being kind of lost, and significantly feeling stuck. And I guess this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of like what's a kind of response that women are going to work through and process and move through and come out the other side of, and what is an experience that women are kind of going to get stuck in and find really difficult to process and move through. So birth trauma in terms of timing, generally speaking, is those kinds of symptoms that exist and persist for a month or more after the birth. So that's one end of the continuum. The other end of the continuum is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very much more in that kind of diagnostic, psychologically measured end of the universe. And at that end, women come through the experience with all of those feelings I've just described, as well as symptoms like flashbacks, reliving the experience of the birth, nightmares, hypervigilance, a feeling of avoidance, so trying to avoid anything that reminds them of the experience. They might feel really numb, kind of cut off from reality, like they're in a bit of a dream state. There's impacts to their memory, and there's really significant impacts to their interpersonal relationships. So kind of all of that is part of what is birth trauma, and a whole bunch of stuff that sits in between along that continuum. And it's really important to say that even though we bring in that kind of diagnostic frame and use that kind of psychological lens, trauma is a normal response to an overwhelming event. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you're crazy. It doesn't mean that you're weird. It doesn't mean that you're deficient. It doesn't mean that you can't cope. It's actually a normal physiological response to an event that your nervous system thinks is a threat to your life or your baby's life.
Mm.
Mm.
What about women who, and I know that I've worked with women that have experienced this, who have had a birth that was less than optimal or what they thought it was going to be, and then didn't have feelings of trauma or upset or any of the things that you talk about until they're pregnant again. And then it comes, and they're quite overwhelmed with it because they haven't had those feelings since the last birth. So can you just speak to that a little bit and how that plays out?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Jo. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We do see this quite a lot. So, sort of technically speaking, that I would put that in the basket of what we call re-traumatization. Yeah. So we know that having a previous distressing or traumatic birth is actually a risk factor for having a traumatic experience at birth. So the phenomena that you're describing seems to be that it can roll out that you have a distressing experience, but we are all so good at packing that stuff away, right? At compartmentalizing. We all have a huge range of adaptations and strategies that we use in our everyday lives that enable us to deal with things that feel distressing or threatening or emotionally destabilizing. So for those women, I think that stuff comes online and they're able to kind of deal, essentially. Yeah. But what happens when you're pregnant again is that you get tipped into a re-traumatization. So it's like your whole nervous system suddenly comes back online and it's like, oh, wait a minute. I've seen this before. I know what happens here. And all the alarms start going off. And I'm really pleased that you asked, because actually this phenomena of re-traumatization is really significant, specifically to do with birth trauma, because actually a lot of birth trauma is re-traumatization. And the reason that I say that is one of the other most significant risk factors for a woman having a traumatic experience at birth is a previous experience of sexual assault, sexual violence, intimate partner violence. And when we look at the numbers that we know in our community and our larger society of women who have had those experiences, every one of them, when they come into birth, is at risk of being re-traumatized, which is what you're talking about, Jo, coming back into a situation where something kind of turns the alarm bells back on when we show up. The word that is often used to describe that is triggering. Yeah, something triggers our nervous system. And then it literally all rises back to the surface. It just kind of bubbles up. So it can be really confusing and distressing for women.
Athena, is there a clear differentiation between, and does it matter, between birth trauma and postnatal depression? You know, if someone's sitting with big feelings post having their baby, is there a way of clearly defining that? And does it matter what the differentiation of that is?
It's a really good question, Rue. On paper, yes, there is a way of differentiating. So again, thinking about those kind of diagnostic criteria, they do look a little bit different. In fact, one of the ways that I think about it is that birth trauma tends to be a kind of a response from our nervous system that sort of winds us up. You know what I mean? It's like it tightens everything up. We get anxious. We spiral kind of upwards into a very hypervigilant, very anxious, very sensitized, very escalated kind of state, generally speaking. Postnatal depression kind of goes in the other direction. It's like we kind of spiral downwards into a place that's more kind of immobilized, more kind of shut down, it's more a feeling of hopelessness
Yeah. When we think about what happens in your nervous system, it's like it goes to a place in postnatal depression where it's like the message is, I can't. I just can't. In birth trauma, the message is more like, I have to. Yeah, there's more this sense of like, kind of high level energy. Depression is more like, I'm going into collapse. I just can't be doing with this shit.
That's such a great description.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
I've
It's
never
awesome.
heard it put like that. That's beautiful. It's so clear.
Great. And of course, there are lots of resources out there where people can really easily find the lists from a diagnostic perspective, from a sort of technical perspective of what the differences are.
Mm.
That's how I think about it. And to your question, Rue, about does it matter? I think one of the ways in which it can matter is depending on where you're seeking help, you will get a different kind of response and a different kind of treatment. So the usual frontline treatment for postnatal depression is antidepressant medication. That is not necessarily actually going to assist you with birth trauma.
Got it.
Hey there, Zoe Naylor here from the Birth Time team. If you've seen Birth Time the documentary and loved it, why not gift the film to help educate and inspire other women and people from around the world? Just head to the birchtime.world shop where you can buy a digital gift card and send it online to anyone you like. It's a brilliant way to help spread the message and be part of the movement. Now it's back to the podcast.
Athena, what makes birth trauma different from other trauma?
There's quite a few things that make birth trauma different from other trauma. There's a couple of things that, in my experience, are kind of significant in this space. One of which is the idea that birth trauma is kind of complicated by this cultural expectation that having a baby, generally speaking, and I understand that this is not the case for everyone, but generally speaking, having a baby is seen as a kind of celebratory, life-affirming, overwhelmingly positive experience to have, right? You've had a baby. Wow. Yeah. And so a lot of the women that I talk to find that their distressed feelings are complicated by this terrible guilt and shame that, in fact, they don't feel celebratory. You know, they don't feel like they've had an experience that is life affirming, or in fact, that is even really positive for them. And at the same time, they have this little baby that they're taking home with them that they love and adore. And so there's this real complication around how do we hold both? How do we be in that space where we're transitioning into motherhood or parenthood and trying to attach to our babies, and at the same time knowing that we haven't had the experience that, in inverted commas, we were supposed to have. I think that's a really complicating factor for women. And there's one other thing that I see and hear from women a lot, and this is, I don't know, this is marginally controversial, and you can maybe chop it out if you want to, but there's a way in which, and again, this is kind of to do with culture, there is a kind of growing culture, a kind of, you know, sometimes it's called a positive birth movement, right? Yes, great, fantastic, love that in lots of ways. But some women come in with a real feeling that the fault lies only with them, because part of the messaging around that culture of empowerment or kind of manifesting is that it's your work to do to create the birth that you deserve. And I see some benefit in that way of thinking in some contexts, but it doesn't take into consideration the machinery that women come up against when they step into the system, and the fact that they step into a system which is not willing to share power with them, actually. And so they come out the other side feeling not only all of the other feelings that we've talked about, but also somehow that it was their responsibility to get that right, and that there must be something that they did wrong in order for them to have had the outcome that they have had. So there's a part of me that is just really keen to sort of uncouple some of that thinking so that there's a little bit more space in between those ideas of the preparation that we do, what we deserve, and the outcome that occurs.
There's a quote in the film that says women come out feeling like they have failed themselves, but actually it's the system that's failing them. And it is that there is a lot of messaging around, you know, create your amazing birth. You've just got to put your mind to it and it will happen. And also, I think there's that big factor of there are two people involved in birth as well. You know, that there is you and your body, and there is your baby, and it cannot all be controlled by you.
There's a little passenger there that's got its own journey.
That's right.
Yeah, very much so.
So with the women that you work with, obviously you're doing psychotherapy with clients who, do they self refer to you? Is that how it works?
It's a mixture of things.
Yeah.
So a lot of women find me. A lot of midwives refer to me. Yeah. And I do get some referrals from other spaces as well. But the majority of people, I would say, find their way. Yeah.
So what are some of the effects for those women that you speak with and people that you speak with that have experienced trauma through pregnancy and birth? How does it manifest?
It's such a good question, Jo. And as you can imagine, there's a really broad kind of scope and spectrum. I would say the things that I see most commonly are what we call hypervigilance, which is a sense of, it's kind of like, sometimes we talk about it as like a car alarm that can't be turned off. It's like your internal car alarm has been switched on, but you can't find the switch to turn it off. Yeah, so everything is really escalated, everything is heightened. You're very worried all the time, but you're kind of not quite sure what you're worried about. Right? And hyper as in a lot of, vigilance as in watchfulness. Yeah, so there's this real sense of not being able to regulate, not being able to settle, just being really activated all the time. I see a lot of that. Sometimes the hypervigilance is focused on the baby, and sometimes we end up with, so with PTSD, one of the criteria is the experience of flashbacks. What I interestingly see quite often, some women do have flashbacks, but a lot of women have what I and some other people call flash forwards, which is to do with the hypervigilance. It's like these kind of intrusive thoughts where once you get into that hypervigilant kind of cycle, it's literally like your brain just starts showing you these images of terrible things that might happen. Yeah, sometimes involving the baby, sometimes involving you or other people you love or care about. So that's kind of at the pointier end of things. Yeah. So both flashbacks and flash forwards, hypervigilance. Again, at the pointy end, we see the things that we refer to as derealization and depersonalization, which is like a feeling that women find really difficult to express, which is sort of like that they're not really here. So there's a sense that they went through the birth process and they came out the other side, but it's almost like they feel like they left part of themselves behind. And so from a therapeutic perspective, what we're kind of talking about there is integration, right? So it's literally like you've lost a bit of yourself. And women might say things like, I just don't feel like I'm the mother of this baby. Or they might say things like, literally, they might say, I feel like I went somewhere and not all of me came back. Yeah. Or derealization is this sense that almost like kind of nothing is real. Is this really happening? I don't even really feel like I'm here anymore. I'm not quite sure how to judge what is real and what is just this internal experience that I'm in.
So in terms of the therapy that you do with women and people, how is it that, I mean, how do you engage with that? And what sort of, I mean, obviously there's talking therapy. Is that the way in which you do it, or is there other sort of modalities that come in that you use to help women, you know, work through whatever they're feeling?
So I'm trained as a psychotherapist. So psychotherapy is a talk therapy model. But I'm also trained as a trauma therapist, and certainly in the trauma universe, and anybody who cares to go anywhere near Instagram and put in anything about somatic experiencing or somatic therapy or somatic psychotherapy will know that there is an entire world that has very rapidly become available to people over the last, I would say, 2 to 5 years, around the notion that we need to work with the body as well as with the talk therapy. So that can happen in lots of different ways. A lot of them are really subtle, and a lot of them are really particular. So to be honest with you, I feel like I'm sort of in a place professionally at the moment where I've kind of come out, I've worked my way through the kind of talk therapy and the trauma world. And my sense right at the moment is that for me, I'm kind of sitting right on the verge of kind of launching towards one of those more somatic styles of therapy. I'm just not quite there yet. So it's like all of the stuff has come into the room to sort of inform what I'm doing, but I don't have a particular modality, somatically speaking. So somatic meaning of the body, meaning working directly with the body. So those kinds of modalities might be things like neuroaffective touch is one that's kind of gaining a lot of ground. And in fact, the woman who is the founder or the sort of developer of neuroaffective touch, which, as it sounds like, is a form of trauma therapy in which we actually use touch to repair, essentially, which, as you know, probably traditionally in therapy, touch is a big no-no. So it's considered kind of edge of the wedge stuff, but it's really evidence-based, and she's got a lot of kind of interest building around what she does. She has a really interesting focus around the connection between the pelvic floor and the larynx and the vocal cords. So pelvic floor, diaphragm, larynx, vocal cords, which is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but it's really interesting when we think about what women come out of those experiences saying, because so often they come out of the experience saying, I don't know what happened to me. I got in there and I just couldn't say anything. I just couldn't advocate for myself. Right? I hear this so frequently. Women say, I don't know, I'm quite a bolshy person. You know, you put me in a supermarket queue, like I'll say what's happening. But I got in there and something happened to me, and it was literally like I had no voice.
So is the idea around that if there's trauma in the pelvic area, it will shut down, and it will also shut down your voice. That's
Yes.
the idea, right? Wow.
Wow.
In a nutshell, yes. That there is a kind of integrated physiological connection between these sort of muscular, she calls them hammocks, these sort of muscular hammocks. So one right at the base, which is the pelvic floor, one in the middle, which is the diaphragm, and then there's one that sits up around the throat, which I think is called the thoracic inlet, but I could have that wrong, so don't quote me. And that actually, when we breathe and move, that these three things interact very deeply with each other. And that, yes, if we are holding, or the word she uses actually is bracing, you know, when something icky is happening and you start to feel you brace. like your muscles start to tighten. You're kind of holding, almost like you're kind of ready for the impact. So if you start to brace in your pelvic floor, there is a relationship then between diaphragm, so breath, and larynx and vocal cords, which for those of us who've been around birth a lot kind of makes, well, to me, kind of makes intuitive sense.
So how does touch therapy, how would that work in that scenario? Is that what you're saying with somatic therapy? It's touch therapy with this idea that the everything is connected. How does touch therapy or somatic therapy work in that scenario?
That's exactly what I want to find out, Joe Hunter.
Okay.
That's the bit I haven't got to yet. So, I mean, I have some sense of it, and also really important to say that not all somatic therapies do involve touch. This one is actually very particular. So the more common approaches are approaches where, and certainly this is very much what I do in my work, where we're bringing in awareness of the body. So we're still sort of talking we're still in a talk therapy framework, but quite often what we'll do is, so for example, if I'm sitting with you, Joe, and we're talking about what happened at your birth, and I'm watching you and I might see something happen in you. And so I might say to you, I'm noticing this thing. Can you tell me, what are you feeling, or what's happening in your body, or what's that thing that you're doing with your hands? Or, oh, I've noticed you've put your hand up to your throat. Can we talk about that? What's that feeling? Is there something there that needs to be attended to? Amazing. Yeah, so it's this sense of trying to attend to what is happening in the body as part of the talk therapy framework. Neuroaffective touch is another step further.
There's also that whole idea around, and Rue, you did this yourself as birth preparation with the internal releases, like actual internal pelvic work, and how it does release actual trauma in your body. Did you experience that, Rue? And I know I've spoken to clients that have totally experienced that in a preparation way for their birth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the experience of that for me was pretty, it was pretty profound. I mean, I didn't feel like I had any extreme trauma to release in that, but it was quite incredible to explore that space and feel the space of the pelvis, and find different areas of tension and emotional connection to those tense places, and to try and work towards releasing that. It was quite an incredible process, actually. But yeah, similarly, I mean, I think we've had some joint clients, Joe, who have had quite extreme experiences of exploring that space and the things that come up, and even that the therapist picks up in that space. So yeah, huge.
And makes complete sense when we think about the intense physicality of birth, right? I mean, we can't really consider this space without working with the body. It doesn't really make any sense.
No.
Yeah. I mean, what we've said before is that, obviously, birth traumas can be both physical and emotional, or just physical or just emotional.
Yeah.
So it doesn't always involve a physical aspect. It could just be around how somebody's spoken to or treated, or, the lack of consent, that sort of thing. But more often than not, it's also physical, right?
Yeah, and I think part of it can be just our responses to being treated in those ways. Yeah, there's a kind of shutdown that happens in the body, right? A kind of protection, a kind of closing off, or it's sort of turning away from. That happens when we are treated unkindly, disrespectfully, or worse. Yeah, so there are sort of aspects of the way that we hold those experiences. But you're right, Joe, particularly when we think about, again, the breadth of experiences that women have. And sometimes women do come out very much with kind of emotional / psychological, I would use the word damage, rather than there being an emphasis on physical damage. And I know we've talked about this stuff before, in the languaging. So birth trauma is often sort of spoken about as a physical impact. So particularly in in terms of perineal damage, that there's a traumatic element, but it's kind of wrapped in this very physical package it's really important to stress that you don't have to have a physical event like that in order to come out the other side feeling emotionally and psychologically overwhelmed.
Athena, in your practice, you not only treat birth trauma in women and birthing families, but also birth workers as well, yes?
Yeah.
Can you tell us the kind of things that present in that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's kind of a newish space for me. So it's something, well, in fact, it's not so much that it's new, it's that it's a smaller part of what I do. So just to be clear, I think, so you're hearing me hesitate because I'm kind of making a decision about whether I'm just going to go off into one of my rants about what I reckon or whether I should actually stick to answering your question, Rue. So
I'd like you to go off on a rant, thanks.
Times two.
Go there. Go right there.
And I guess the reason I'm tempted to go towards the rant is that I feel like even when birth workers come in, particularly midwives and obstetricians, there is a sense of them being so impacted by the enormity of what they are holding that in some ways I don't think I even see most of it. Like it's just tip of the iceberg stuff, I reckon. Because I think if we really fling those doors open, there's a great concern and a kind of intuitive fear for people who work in the space because, part of the culture is that in order to do your job properly, you have to be able to hack it, right? It's like, if you can't hack it, then you shouldn't be here. This is not where you belong. You've got to be able to take what's dished out to you. Like we're very encultured, particularly in the hospital I'm talking. We're very encultured in that space around this idea that it's like, yeah, it's hard. Yes, it's incredibly stressful. Yes, it will probably make you go into the pan room and cry. But part of earning your stripes and feeling like you can do your job properly is demonstrating that you are not affected by those things. So you can imagine that over time, the defenses and the strategies and the disconnection that you have to employ in order to survive in that space is considerable.
Yeah.
And there's also the idea that you might find out that you're actually complicit,
right?
Some of the trauma, which would be really hard to hear and believe and
really
discuss and accept.
Yep. And that's one of the great griefs that midwives tend to bring in. Yeah, is that there's a huge grief and a huge, as you say, Jo, a real fear and a real oh man, if I turn towards that, we're going down into the pit, that's like we're in the really, really tricky stuff. We're in the dark, dirty, sticky stuff. Because how do we as practitioners, how do we have those conversations? How do we carry and manage our own felt sense of working within a system that may not always have the best interests of women at heart? What do we do with that? And what do we do with the fact that we have to get up and go back, each day? It's like I have to keep returning to this site. And when we talk about trauma, so of course, I'm a trauma therapist. I think everyone's traumatized. Okay. I'm just going to put that on the table. We'll just get that out there so that there's no pretense around that. So my sense is that, everybody who works in the maternity care system is traumatized. Whether or not that is actually true is another thing. I'm sure there must be some people in there who are sort of freewheeling and carefree and unaffected and feeling really, really great about the work that they do. I don't meet a lot of those people. So when midwives come in to try and answer your original question, I guess grief, I see a lot of grief. I see a lot of guilt and shame. And I see a lot of anger. I think it's a really great idea, if it's in any way possible, for midwives and birth workers to support each other in these processes. And so whether that means that, you know, you do something where you have a kind of, you know, phone a friend system where after work you can sit in the car park and do a 2-minute rant on the phone to one of your colleagues with complete confidentiality, and no one has to respond. There's no fixing, there's no responding. It's just something to allow you to discharge some of that energy which is held in the body from being stuck in that activation all the time.
I think a lot of people probably do that quite informally.
Yeah.
To be honest, I think probably most do that. But yeah, do you think to have some sort of formal, you know, like with counselling, you obviously for you would have to, you're holding on to everybody's trauma now that you're hearing it. So you need to have somewhere to dump it, and in the form of supervision, right? That's what happens with counsellors and psychotherapists. But there's not that for midwives. There's not that for health professionals at all.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, you've put your finger on something enormously significant there, which is that structurally there is no infrastructure to support midwives or obstetricians for that matter in the work that they do. And there bloody well should be. All midwives should have regular supervision. It should be trauma informed. And, you know, I reckon if I had my way, that also all midwives should have the option to attend some kind of supportive counselling. What that actually looks like could be quite varied and quite different depending on what's available and what's needed. But I guess what I kind of hear from midwives quite often is, well, I was falling to pieces, and so they offered me the opportunity to go and speak to an EAP counsellor. So an EAP counsellor is someone who works as part of a system within the healthcare or any other professional setting, and it's free and it's often very good, but it's not provided by another midwife. And so there's a way in which they just don't feel met or understood.
So do you feel by offering something like that within the system, as a mandatory monthly, however it would look, would decrease the incidence of birth trauma?
Oh, Jo, I don't know. Like I would like to just say yes, but I really, as someone with a research background, I'm like, ooh, I wouldn't.
There's no research on that.
Right? I wouldn't really want to go out on that limb. I mean,
makes sense.
It makes intuitive sense. Absolutely. But the other thing is, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I talk to sort of core staff midwives, like they're so exhausted and they're so over it and they're so stressed and they're so overworked. And, you know, the workforce numbers are not improving at the moment, right? The projections for midwifery workforce are reasonably dire at the moment. And we know already that hospital midwives are, you know, stretched so far. And I think quite often it can just seem like another thing to do. Like if we were to say there's a mandatory monthly supervision group that you have to come to, I just don't know how that would go. I just have a sense that it's like another kind of burdensome work associated thing that you have to do. Regardless
of that, regardless of how stretched someone is or how stressed they are, it's still not ever okay to not treat somebody else, a patient or a woman coming in, with the deepest respect and kindness and empathy. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really hear you. And this is the great dilemma, right? And this is the great kind of schism, is that we have this belief system in which most of us hold that to be the absolute truth. And yet at the same time, we're in a situation where for so many of those midwives, it's really difficult to achieve something that shouldn't be difficult to achieve.
One of the ways that you can support the birth time movement is to invest in some birth time merchandise. Getting the merch out there helps build brand awareness and encourages people to watch the film. It also kickstarts much needed conversations within our communities. We have a bag, a book, keep cup and organic and sustainably sourced hoodies and t-shirts. Head to birthtime.world to find out more.
How did you get to being where you are? What led you? Did you have life experience of birth trauma as a woman and as a midwife working in the system? Is that how you got here?
Yes and yes. So I was young when I had my son. I had him when I was, how old was I, Jo Hunter? I can never remember.
27.
27, thank you. So I think I was pregnant while I was 26. And then by the time he was born, I think I was just turning 27. So which now at 52, and now I look back on that and I feel like that seems kind of really young. And I was in a situation which many women will be in. And this is kind of part of the bigger picture in terms of how we're approaching birth trauma for women in the system. I was someone who had previous trauma in my history, and in particular in my childhood. And like many other women, was totally unaware that that would have any sort of impact on me when it came time for my body to do what was required for it to give birth. I think about things very differently now, but back then it just felt like a complete sort of failure to launch, you know, like my body just felt like it wasn't able, despite all of my efforts, just felt like it wasn't able to do what it needed to do. So my son's 25 now, he's just about to turn 26. And I was a planned home birth, but a transfer. So he ended up being born in hospital and he was a forceps delivery. And it was not good. I was not well cared for. The registrar that ended up doing the forceps was great. He was really connected, you know, he connected with me, he reassured me, he gave me some choices, and I felt like he was a safe human. Not really very much of that from anybody else in the room. So I came out of that not really understanding very much about what had happened to me physiologically or psychologically, but certainly with a very significant burden of guilt and shame and failure. And really a lot of wear and tear on my relationship with my partner, which again, I see this really commonly now because I felt so abandoned and so alone in that experience, and felt that the support, even though I probably wouldn't have been able to articulate it, there was just some way in which I needed to be supported that I wasn't. And so then that was kind of living between us. You know, we're like new parents, we're young people, we're trying to navigate our way through this process without a great deal of family support for either of us, actually. So that was a really kind of ongoing sort of injury, I guess, in a way, was the damage to the relationship and the way in which that then had flow-on effects in terms of sort of sexuality, mental health, well-being, connection, all of those things that we're looking for, and also the creation of a kind of solid, well-resourced family to bring this little baby up. So now that I look back on it, I feel like, yeah, I absolutely had birth trauma. I went through a pretty sort of, even on paper, like a pretty traumatic birth. And I can see that, yes, I did experience a lot of the things that I now talk about with women who've had similar experiences.
Were you a midwife when you had your baby, Athena, or did that happen later?
No, good question, Rue. It happened later. I'm one of those midwives who became a midwife because I was like, that was so shit. I do not want that to happen to anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a great drive and a great motivator. So even though that experience was what it was, it also kind of got me to where I am.
Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Jo. I actually don't talk about it all that often, interestingly. But I'm very happy to share it with you guys.
Yeah, that's big. Thank you.
Okay, so let's end off with the question that we're asking everybody, which is the same question we asked everybody in the film. So what, in your opinion, would it take for all women to emerge from their births physically well and emotionally safe?
It's a huge question. Okay, the disruption or the dismantling of patriarchal culture, number fucking one.
Check.
That's it.
Need we go on? I think.
There's the answer. Moving right along.
Right? I was just like, where will I go from here? Access to continuity of one-to-one midwifery care for all women. The positioning of midwifery in the community as opposed to tucked away in the hospital. I know there is some of that goes on. There needs to be a lot more. And you know what? On an individual level, I guess there's this way of thinking about what happens to us as we move through the world that comes from a therapist that I'm familiar with, and they talk about, you know, when we're thinking about clients, right, and working with clients, one of the ways that they offer for us to imagine what is happening for the client is to ask ourselves, are they in a loved world or are they in an unloved world? And I feel like when women show up to have a baby, they should know that they are in a loved world. And they should not ever be left in a space where they feel unloved, unsupported, unseen, unheard. And whatever that looks like, I actually don't care. I just want women to receive that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I was so nervous to do this with you guys. You're actually not that scary after all.
We need to try harder.
Be more intimidating.
And that's a wrap. You can check out the show notes to find websites, books, research articles, social media handles, and general information about each of our podcast guests. Thank you to our fabulous Birth Time sisters, Zoe Naylor and Selena Scoble, for supporting the creation of this podcast behind the scenes. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to follow or subscribe to Birth Time the podcast. Leave us a review and a rating, and please, we'd really love it if you'd share it amongst your friends and networks. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at Birthtime World, and our website birthtime.world, where you can also stream and watch our international award-winning film, Birthtime the Documentary. You can find out more about me, Jo Hunter, and my midwifery work at midwifejo.com.au, and more about Jerusha Sutton and her gorgeous photography and doula work at jerusha.com.au. And thank you to you, our beautiful Birth Time family, for tuning in to Birth Time, the podcast. We really do appreciate you all so, so much. Until next time.